60th birthday. They made me use the back door until someone said, "Madam CEO," and the room went silent. My name is Blake Lively. I'm 36 years old and the founder of Solace Grid, a renewable energy startup that now powers over 200 farming communities across the southern U.S. But that night, standing on the side path of my parents' ranch house in rural Texas, holding a gift carefully chosen for a man who had ignored much, none of it seemed to matter. When my younger brother Chase pointed toward the shed and said, "You should park back there. Use the side door, the front's for the guests." I didn't say anything. I smiled faintly. I was the daughter who ran off to California with a laptop. They were boots on not yet. My father, Everett Lively, was a rancher with roots as deep as the pecan trees on our land, the kind of man who measured success in acres and inheritance, not innovation or equity. To him, Chase and my older brother Dean were the future of the Lively legacy. I was the daughter who ran off to California with a laptop. They were boots-on-the-ground cattlemen. I was solar panels and spreadsheets, and for nearly 15 years, that was enough to keep me on the fringes of family photos when I was included at all. Growing up in Brazoria County, I was the odd one, not rebellious, just different. While my brother spent summers learning feed schedules and tractor maintenance, I spent mine wiring backyard lights to mini solar cells on mine. My dad never asked about it. I left for Stanford on a full scholarship that I was just going through a phase all girls grow out of tech stuff eventually. I was 12 by the time I graduated high school valedictorian. I had already filed my first provisional patent, a smart battery storage system I built in the barn, using surplus wires from a busted combine. My dad never asked about it. I left for Stanford on a full scholarship and didn't hear from him once during the 4 years I was gone. Not for birthdays. Not even when I made the cover of a student innovation journal. Mom called sometimes, always cautiously, like she was watching the weather change before stepping outside. And when I launched Solace Grid from a shared garage in San Jose at 24, she mailed me a card with 5 $20 bills taped inside. The message said, "For your dreams, sweetheart. But don't tell Dad. The real break happened the year I turned 28. I'd flown home for Thanksgiving, the only visit I had made since leaving for college, over dinner, to land. He said simply, "You chose your world. This one's not a chase," would be given the deed to the ranch, the land, the equipment, the house. "It's staying in the family," he said, and everyone nodded. I sat there stunned, a glass of untouched wine in my hand. "What about me?" I asked. The room went quiet. My father didn't even look at me. "You don't work the land." He said simply, "You chose your world. This one's not yours anymore." I left before dessert. I didn't call home for nearly 4 years after that. Not when Solace Grid secured a multi-million-dollar grant from the Department of Energy. Not when we opened our first field office in Louisiana. Not when we crossed into profitability or started attracting attention from agricultural. There was no "he misses you," no "we're proud." Just wait. Maybe out of something deeper. And told myself I didn't care what my family thought. But that wasn't entirely true, because when the email came from my mother short, polite, not overly emotional. I read it twice. "Your father's turning 60. There's a dinner at the ranch. We'd like for you to be there. Please let me know." There was no "he misses you." No "we're proud." Just logistics. But I still bought a plane ticket. I still found myself standing on that dirt road outside our family home a week later, holding a custom-engraved solar charger shaped like a cattle brand, the closest thing to a peace offering I could manage. I should have known better. Should have known that even with the suit, the resume, the Forbes feature, I would still be told to use the back door. But what happened next, that I regretted not wearing boots. But then again, I was never allowed to back by the equipment barn, next to a rusting hay baler and 2 mud-splattered ATVs. The dust kicked up as I stepped out in heels. A deliberate choice I had second-guessed 10 times on the flight. Now, standing between 2 tractors with nothing but silence and dry wind around me, I regretted not wearing boots. But then again, I was never allowed to wear them in there of the caterers. No one greeted me. My name wasn't mentioned. Then since the last storm season, I stepped into the house I grew up in, where every inch should have felt familiar. But instead, I felt like a stranger arriving without warning. The kitchen smelled of burnt sugar and brisket. Two women I didn't recognize glanced at me and immediately looked away, assuming I was one of the caterers. No one greeted me. My name wasn't mentioned. Then I saw her. My mother. Lillian. Her back was to me, arranging a tray of deviled eggs like it was her lifeline. I cleared my throat gently. She turned, startled, eyes widening slightly, as if she had imagined I might not come. "Blake," she said softly, stepping forward with the same smile I remembered from childhood, warm. "Caucus, apologetic. You look beautiful." I thanked her, meaning it. But before I could say more, one of the women nearby asked, "Do you want the helper to bring out the dessert tray, Mrs. Lively? My mother wants gathering there now. You can leave it on the side table. Your father's—" The woman's eyes widened in horror. She mumbled something and backed away, leaving behind a silence that pressed like weight on my shoulders. I gave a small smile, like I'd just brushed off a cobweb, and lifted the gift in my hand. "Where should I put this?" She nodded toward the dining room. "Everyone's gathering there now. You can leave it on the side table. Your father's. In the living room." Where it was again. That unspoken barrier. Your father. Not Dad. Not he's excited to see you. Just location. Not emotion. Like coordinating furniture. I walked slowly toward the dining room. The house had been redecorated, but not much. A few newer photographs, mostly of Chase and Dean with their holding Dean in the hospital room. Chase on a tractor at age 5, in matching family portraits with hay bales and golden hour lighting. I didn't appear in any of the frames. On the wall beside the hallway, they had created a tribute wall for my dad's birthday. Dozens of photos from his life, clipped and pinned like a scrapbook on display. His childhood on the ranch, wedding with my mom, holding Dean in the hospital room, Chase on a tractor at age 5, their high school football victories, their weddings, their kids, but not a single photo of me. Past the age of 16, I looked carefully, scanned everything twice. Nothing. It was like I had been photoshopped out of the family story. I entered the litha doorway, invisible. Then I saw him, my father. Low Texas draws, polished belt buckles, women in floral dresses sipping sweet tea. Everyone turned when Dean walked in, greeting him with applause and backslaps. He looked like a politician shaking hands. Then Chase arrived, and was immediately swarmed by neighbors and old ranch partners. I stood near the doorway, invisible. Then I saw him, my father. His posture was stiff, chin lifted. He's already scanning someone else as I approached. I waited until Dean noticed me first. "Dad," he said loudly. "Look, appreciate this." He took it without unwrapping it. "Thanks. He anything? Warmth? Surprise? Nostalgia?" Instead, I got a polite nod. "Blake," he said flatly. "Glad you made it. Not, I missed you. Not, you look well. Just acknowledgement, like I was a former student at a school reunion. Happy birthday," I said, handing him the gift. "I thought you might appreciate this." He took it without unwrapping it. "Thanks," he said, placing it behind him. He turned back to the conversation without a second glance. And just like that, announced soon after, I was seated at the far end of the hall with 3 kids. If that made up for the 10 years of silence. "Friends around here somewhere," he said, referencing his wife. "She'll want to say hello." I nodded, but it wasn't a hello I needed. It was the recognition that I was part of this family too, that I hadn't disappeared, just because I didn't wear boots to work. Dinner was announced soon after. I was seated at the far end of the hall with 3 guests I didn't know. My brothers and their wives sat near my parents at the main table. I was close enough to hear them talk about cattle prices and weather patterns, about a new grain silo being installed in the south field. They never once asked me about Solace Grid, or how I was doing, or even what I had been building all these years. I wasn't curious anymore. I was angry, but even more than that, I was tired. tired of being erased in slow motion, tired of pretending the distance was just time, tired of telling myself that showing up was enough, and still, I stayed. I stayed through the toasts. I stayed when Dean told the story of how Dad taught him to rope cattle. I stayed when Chase handed Dad a framed aerial photo of the ranch and got a bear hug in return. I stayed because I knew the moment was coming. I didn't know when or how to hang my plate under cold water like a stranger trying to be useful. My mom. That ignoring someone is a form of control. But silence also creates tension, and when the right voice cuts through that silence, everything shifts. After dinner, people drifted toward the porch with their wine glasses and birthday cake slices. Laughter spilled out from the sliding glass doors. I stayed behind in the kitchen, rinsing my plate under cold water like a stranger trying to be useful. My mother passed behind me, front out of habit. Maybe. The sun was dropping behind me. Then she disappeared, called away by someone needing napkins or one of the grandkids asking for apple pie. I found myself alone again, not excluded this time by a decision, but by years of small silences that had hardened into routine. I needed air. I stepped out the side door, not the front out of habit. Maybe. The sun was dropping behind the barn, painting everything in honeyed gold. I stood there quietly, breathing in the smell of the carpets cleaned. It wasn't the words that stung. It was the indifference in them. Was Dean? He walked with his arms crossed, his mouth tight, like he was trying to make a decision before speaking. "Hey," he said. "Finally. You okay?" I gave him a look. He exhaled, glanced down at my shoes, and then said it. "If you're heading back in, maybe go around to the side again. Mom just had the carpets cleaned." It wasn't the words that stung. It was the indifference in them, the assumption that I was the problem, that my shoes, cleaner than his, were a threat to his comfort. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just stood still as he walked away, not even turning back to see if I was following his suggestion. I stayed outside longer than I should have, replaying the whole evening in my mind. From the moment I arrived, I didn't. Cheerful. And loud enough to turn heads. Excuse me. Seat at the family table. No warmth from my father. And now, no front door. I wasn't angry anymore. I was resolved. As I stood beneath the porch light, something shifted in the energy of the house. I heard the front door swing open. The murmur of conversation paused. And then a voice rang out, confident, cheerful, and loud enough to turn heads. "Excuse me," it called. "Is Blake Lively here?" I was told she might be attending. The name landed like a rock, dropped into still water. I walked toward the front door slowly, the way one walks into a room filled with old ghosts. Inside stood a man in his 50s, in a tailored gray blazer and polished boots that gleamed under the entryway light. My eyes widened as I recognized him. "Margin." His voice broke into a grin. "Mad Infrastructure, one of the largest renewable funding coalitions in the western U.S. He had been a panelist with me last year in Austin. I'd spoken on a stage with him, answered his direct questions about community microgrids, and handed him my card personally afterward. I hadn't known he'd remember me. Apparently, he had. "There she is," he said when his eyes found mine. His voice broke into a grin. "Madam CEO of Solace Grid. It's an honor." And just like that, the room shifted. People looked. My father looked. Even Chase stopped mid-conversation. Mark walked over and shook my hand like we were old colleagues. "I heard your name from the guy at the Chamber of Commerce. Told me you might be out here for your father's birthday. So I took the chance. I've been meaning to reach out anyway. Our team's looking at expanding support for low-footprint energy projects in ranching regions. Your work is exactly what we've been discussing." I smiled, steady but controlled. "I'd love to talk more." "Oh, we will," he said easily. "In fact, I just read the article in Agritech Monthly, your interview on scalable solar irrigation that's been circling our office all month. You're doing incredible work." Behind him, I saw Dean blink. Chase shifted his weight on Come My Father. His jaw was tight, his arms crossed. If he felt and what was happening, but refusing to adjust fast enough to catch up. Mark looked around and added, almost too casually, I imagine your family must be incredibly proud of the impact you're making. Silence again, the kind that doesn't just fall, it lands. I glanced at my father. His jaw was tight, his arms crossed. If he felt anything like pride, it didn't show. They're proud in their own ways, I said. I saw Mark register the tension, but steer away from it like a seasoned politician. Well, let me not interrupt that for one moment. He might say something will be in touch. Then to my father, you've raised a visionary, Mr. Lively. It's a rare thing. With that, he tipped his head and walked out the front door. Not the side, not the kitchen. The front, like someone who knew where he belonged in the silence that followed. The family began shifting. Conversations restarted. But this time, they swirled toward me. People I hadn't spoken to all evening asked polite questions. Someone even said they'd heard something about that company in a magazine. My nephews wandered over to ask what solar irrigation meant. I answered kindly, clearly, like a professional, like someone used to being listened to. And then, my father moved toward me. I thought for one moment he might say something, but instead he picked up a plate of pie, turned, and walked away. Not a word. It was the clearest message he had ever given me. The celebration carried on without me. I moved through the rest of the evening like a shadow, smiling when spoken to, answering questions politely, avoiding confrontation. But inside, something had cracked open. Not in a dramatic, tear-filled way, more like a quiet shift in the tectonic plates of how I saw this family. The applause that once meant something back toward the barn to get some air. The field stretched out under a deepening sky, and the way my father had walked away after Mark Delaney's praise. That was the final confirmation of something I had known for years, but refused to name until now. He wasn't proud of me. Not because I failed, but because I succeeded without him. Around chapter 9:30, I slipped out through the kitchen. No one stopped me. I walked back toward the barn to get some air. The field stretched out under a deepening sky, and for a moment, I just stood there in silence. I remembered being 16, sneaking out with an old flashlight to test the first DIY solar circuit I had wired to a motion sensor. I remember how proud I felt, watching that dim bulb flicker to life under a moonless sky. I had rushed in that night to tell Dad. He didn't look up from his invoice sucker. It was Dean. He stood for a moment, hands in pockets. Watching it doesn't work in the real world, but it did. It worked then, and it works now. The world had changed. I had changed, only he hadn't. I sat on the fence, staring at the silhouette of the old tractor shed. Then, footsteps approached. I expected my mom. It was Dean. He stood for a moment, hands in pockets, watching me quietly. He's just old-fashioned, he said. Like it was a justification. He doesn't mean anything by it. I didn't look at him. You all keep saying that. But somehow it always ends with me being the one left out. Dean let out a breath. We didn't know Mark would show up, caught us all off guard. That's not the problem, I said. The problem is, you only saw me after he did. Dean stayed quiet. Then finally, you could have told us about the company. We read about it now and then. Sure, but you never really said anything. I laughed quiet. Bitter. I sent clippings. Articles. I emailed updates. I called on holidays. No one replied. And you're telling me the reason you ag? He looked genuinely uncomfortable, and for a second, I thought he flinched, but didn't deny it. Things change. He muttered, maybe it's time we all try again. Try again, I echoed. The words flat in my mouth. That's easy to say now. When you think I can offer something. When Mark Delaney says my name out loud. And suddenly, I'm no longer the girl with city shoes. He looked genuinely uncomfortable, and for a second, I thought he might apologize. Instead, he said, Curtis thinks you left too early, that you gave up on this place. I turned to face him. Curtis didn't speak to me for 10 years. Neither did you. So maybe it wasn't me who gave up. He didn't answer. just nodded and walked away into the night, disappearing like smoke into the dark. I returned to the guest house quietly. It had been offered almost like a formality, not a real welcome. I dropped my shoes by the door, sank into the edge of the bed, and stared at the travel bag still zipped on the chair. My hands were shaking, but not from sadness, from resolve. I didn't fly here for a second chance. I flew here because I needed to see it for myself. I needed to confirm, one last time, that no matter how successful I became, I would never be enough not in their eyes, and watching me with the quiet ache of someone who knew she could. The next morning, I packed early. The sky was still gray and cool when I stepped out. My flight wasn't until the afternoon, but I wanted to be gone before the house woke up. I left the gift behind on the mantel. He hadn't unwrapped it. I didn't care. As I reached the edge of the driveway, the front door opened. My mother stood there in a sweater, arms crossed over her chest, watching me with the quiet ache of someone who knew she couldn't fix what had been broken for too long. Leaving already, she asked. I nodded, didn't see the point in staying longer. I'm sorry, she said, barely above a whisper, for what I asked, for not speaking up. She didn't reply, but her eyes said yes. I stepped forward and gave her a hug. It wasn't warm. It wasn't cold. It was a gesture from one woman who had learned to survive in silence to another who no longer would. On the drive back to Houston, I thought about Solis Grid, about the interns waiting for Monday's demo, about the prototype we were under the weight of not yours, and still found the courage to build anyway, an outreach initiative aimed at providing solar kits and digital literacy to under-resourced ranch communities. I'd hesitated to pursue it, because I thought I might be accused of trying to show up my family. But now I saw it clearly. It was never about them. It was about people like me, girls who grew up under the weight of not yours, and still found the courage to build anyway. Back in my apartment that evening, I unpacked slowly. Then I sat down and drafted a letter, not to my father, not to Dean or Chase, to the Department of Agricultural Equity, a funding proposal for the Rural Solar Education Initiative, fully backed by Solis Grid. I called it Second Light, because sometimes the first place you're told not to belong is exactly where you're meant to lead. The weeks after the party moved faster than I expected, I returned to my office in Austin and dove straight into work. Solis Grid was entering a critical phase. I finally saw the truth, with no filter. I had built something real, and our data showed an unprecedented 28% improvement in water use efficiency. The engineering team was celebrating, investors were circling, but inside me, something deeper was shifting for the first time in years. In hell, I wasn't pushing forward to prove anything to my family. I was doing it because I finally saw the truth, with no filter. I had built something real, whether or not they ever looked. On a quiet Thursday afternoon, my assistant knocked. Blake, she said carefully. You have a visitor. Says his name is Chase Lively. I paused mid-sentence, blinked, then asked. He's here in the lobby, she confirmed. Wants to talk about something urgent. I took a breath, stood up, and walked out without saying another word. They belonged. I let the silence stretch until he filled it. We've been having some if dust, still clinging to his boots, like a badge of identity. His posture wasn't confrontational. It was uncertain. That alone surprised me. Can we talk? He asked, not in command, but in request. I nodded. Come on back. In the conference room. He didn't sit right away. He hovered like someone unsure if they belonged. I let the silence stretch until he filled it. We've been having some issues with the irrigation on the east side of the ranch. The system Dad insists on using is 10 years old. It's inefficient. Wastes a ton of water. I told him that, but he won't listen to me. Just says it worked fine when he was my age. I folded my arms. So why are you here? He looked down, then back up. Because I've seen what your company does. I saw the case study in the magazine. I know you're doing real work. He hesitated. I wanted it's I'll have my team do an assessment. If the numbers check out, I didn't respond immediately. There was no satisfaction in seeing my brother who had told me to use the side door now asking for help. Only clarity. This was what progress looked like, not a victory speech, just someone who had once overlooked you now showing up. Humbled. I finally nodded. Send me the specs and coordinates. I'll have my team do an assessment. If the numbers check out, we'll propose a solution. Commercial rates apply. Of course, he said quickly. Whatever it costs. I mean, we can discuss that. He started to stand, then stopped. By the way, he added, almost like an afterthought, Dad read the magazine. The one with the interview. He didn't say anything, but I saw him fold the page and put it in his drawer. It hit differently than I expected. Not joy, not redemption, just a quiet shift of air, like a door somewhere had opened a crack. Thanks, I said. He left without another word, and I sat back in the chair, staring at the empty space where he'd been, wondering how long it would take for the rest of them to catch up. About making space. When the install finished, I sent the final room arrived at the Lively Ranch, not through the back road, not hidden. We brought 2 trucks and 3 engineers, parked in front like we would with any client. My name wasn't mentioned once in the paperwork, but everyone on site knew whose system they were putting in. I stayed off property during the setup. It wasn't about showing up. It was about making space. When the install finished, I sent the final report directly to Chase. He replied within an hour. Numbers are better than we expected. Already seeing a drop in water use. I'll keep you posted. Then came the ripple effect. Within a month, 3 neighboring ranches requested consultations after seeing the results at our family farm. And this time, they weren't calling Chase. They were calling some worked. The land responded. The neighbors noticed. And suddenly, for it, Lively's place. It's good enough for me. I didn't reply. I just filed it away in my inbox. A quiet receipt for the years they said I didn't belong. It wasn't just about solar panels anymore. It was about narrative. I had stopped fighting for acknowledgement, and instead, let the value speak for itself. The system worked. The land responded. The neighbors noticed. And suddenly, the ones who once using a percentage of some measured by the same tools they had dismissed. That wasn't revenge. That was consequence. By the end of that quarter, Solace Grid's rural program had tripled its inquiries. Mark Delaney reached out again, asking if I'd consider joining a statewide advisory board. On agricultural energy equity, I accepted, but privately. I started working on something more personal, a small fund using a percentage of Solace Grid's net proceeds to support women in rural areas, studying environmental science. I didn't name it after myself. I called it the Side Door Project, because there are too many brilliant minds out there being told to park in the back. 3 months passed before I heard from my father, the kind of email he might send to a contractor. I read it 3 times, typed email sent at 6:04 in the morning with no greeting. The subject line read, soil pressure readings. The message itself was only 1 sentence. Can you review the latest data and see if that E-slope issue is drainage or compaction? No, please. No thank you. No mention of who I was to him. Just the kind of email he might send to a contractor. I read it 3 times, closed my laptop, and sat in silence. It wasn't the message that got to me. It was the fact that for the first time in over a decade, he asked me to solve something he couldn't. I forwarded the data to my engineering lead with a short note. Priority, please model with our soil sensor overlay. Will advise. Then I opened a folder on my desktop labeled Lively. It had been empty until now. The results came back 2 days later. It was a classic slope compression issue, decade sponsor. I didn't need one. That night, for the first time, old mistake, easy fix with the right technology, and a new planting strategy. I packaged the report, added a visual overlay, and replied with a clear breakdown of the problem and solution, ending the message with recommend reversing machine paths next season. We can offer monitoring if desired. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't need one. That night, for the first time, I let myself look at our company's internal dashboard. and click on the tab labeled Family Install. There it was, the Lively Ranch, monitored like any other client, but it didn't feel like any other. It felt like the past, quietly admitting it couldn't win against the future. Then, one morning in October, my assistant handed me a printed invitation, formal, thick cardstock, addressed in cursive, came out to the front porch when he saw my car, and helped carry my bags like it was the bottom. Your father asked if you'd come. I stared at those words like they might vanish. My instinct was to say no, but something deeper told me to pause. It wasn't about validation anymore. It was about presence, so I said yes. When I arrived on Thanksgiving morning, no one told me where to park. No one pointed me to the back. Chase came out to the front porch when he saw my car and helped carry my bags like it was the most natural thing these always are during holidays. My niece Lily climbed into my lap before dessert. There were photos on the hallway wall that hadn't been there before new ones. I didn't expect to be in any, but I was. One of them showed me on stage at a climate conference, mid-speech. Another was a clipping of my Forbes profile. I didn't ask who hung them. I didn't have to. Dinner was loud, full, and slightly chaotic in the way families always are during holidays. My niece Lily climbed into my lap before dessert and asked if I made sunlight into food. I smiled and said, kind of. And for the first time in my life, the table didn't feel like a performance. It felt like a gathering. My brothers talked to me like a sibling, not an outsider. They asked about the new facility we were building near Lubbock. Curtis even mentioned a rancher friend who was curious about our systems. I told him I could connect him. The E-slope's better now. He said simply, appreciate the help. After the dishes were cleared, my father asked if I had a minute to talk. Not in front of everyone, not as a performance, just the two of us, on the back porch, under the same sky I used to stare at when I was a teenager, wondering what the rest of the world looked like. He held a mug of black coffee, steam curling up into the air. The E-slope's better now. He said simply, appreciate the help. I nodded. I'm glad it worked. He shifted his weight slightly. I don't always understand what you do, or how it works, but I know the results, and I know the land hasn't looked this good in 5 years. I stayed quiet. Let him find the next sentence on his own. He took a long sip of coffee, then added, I read the whole article this time. The one in Agritech. Had to ask your mother to explain a few parts. That made me smile. Quietly. He looked down at the cup, like it might give him courage. Then he said it. I was wrong. About you. About what you chose. The words weren't dramatic. They weren't flowery. But maybe it's time we changed that. We stood there for a while without speaking. You worked harder than all of us. He continued. Built something from scratch. Something that works. And I know I didn't make it easy. I know you felt pushed out. I didn't feel pushed out. I said, finally, he nodded, not to argue, but to accept. Well, maybe it's time we changed that. We stood there for a while without speaking. Two people shaped by the same dirt, finally breathing the same air, not in perfect understanding, but in mutual respect. The silence wasn't a wall anymore. It was space. By the end of the year, Solus Grid had expanded into 6 more rural regions. Our new pilot program in West Texas was producing results faster than any initiative we'd rolled out before. The side door project had received. The more the world seemed to align on its own, one after new scholarships to girls from farming communities, girls who, like me, had once been told that their place was in the kitchen or behind someone else's name. But despite all of it, I wasn't chasing headlines anymore. I didn't need the noise. Something had shifted. The more I stepped into my own value, without demanding anyone's recognition, the more the world seemed to align on its own. One afternoon in late January, I got a call from the editor of Agritech Voices, a well-respected industry magazine. They were putting together a feature on multi-generational agricultural transitions, how traditional ranching families were beginning to collaborate with next-generation innovators. We'd love to include your family. She said, it's rare to directly, No small talk. Just, I got a call from some writer for a long second. My family hasn't given a quote. I replied. You'll have to ask them directly. But you can quote me on this legacy only matters when it grows. She laughed gently. That's a hell of a line. A week later, my dad called. Not emailed. Not passed a message through Chase. He called directly. No small talk. Just, I got a call from some writer. Said you gave them our name. Is that something you want us to be part of? I leaned back in my chair and looked out the office window. Toward the soul, I stood in the center, flanked by my brothers and my dad. All of us dressed the way we were. It's whether you think the story matters. He was quiet. Then, with a hint of dry honesty, well, I reckon it does now. They agreed to participate. The article came out mid-February. The photo was taken in the South Pasture, the one I used to be told not to step into when the men were working. This time, I stood in the center, flanked by my brothers and my dad, all of us dressed the way we were. No forced formality, no PR sheen. The headline read, From Silence to Solar, How One Family Farm Found a Future in Innovation. I didn't send the article, horse them too, but because the evidence had become too solid to ignore, it was taped to the refrigerator. The more we worked together, the more the dynamic evolved, not into some perfect fairy tale collaboration, but into something functional, real. My dad still grumbled when we suggested updates. Curtis still rolled his eyes at software dashboards, but they listened, not because I forced them to, but because the evidence. And all the night before, we sat in the hotel lobby, when they introduced me to neighbors. They didn't say she's got some company in the city. They said, she built Solace Grid. The pride wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. In March, we were invited to speak at the Texas Agri-Energy Summit. My father, of all people, agreed to join me on a panel. The night before, we sat in the hotel lobby, just the two of us, reviewing our talking points. He kept fidgeting with the pen in his shirt pocket, like it didn't belong there. Then he looked at me and said, I've read your presentation twice. Still don't understand every part, but I'll back it. I smiled, not to impress him, but because I realized something. I didn't need him to fully understand. I just needed him to stand beside me. The next morning, when we took the stage, I introduced myself first. Then I turned toward him and said, and this is Everett Lively, lifelong rancher and recently converted believer in sustainable energy. The crowd laughed. My dad nodded slightly, eyes narrowed, but not with irritation, with quiet amusement. She's the expert, he said into the mic. I'm just trying to keep up. That line made the recap real. The journey didn't erase the past. It didn't fill in the years I spent proving my worth in silence, or the nights I lay awake wondering what it would have been like to grow up in a house where potential was measured equally. But it made peace with it, not by rewriting what happened, but by making sure it no longer defined what would later that week. My mother handed me an envelope before I left the ranch. Inside were photos, some printed, some clipped from magazines, my face and headlines, my name on conference stages. I saved everything, she said, her voice soft, even when I didn't know if he'd ever look. I didn't cry. I just nodded, placed the envelope in my bag, and thanked her, not just for the papers, but for the quiet faith they represented, because what I had built wasn't just a company. It was a bridge, one I had constructed with patience, with data, with proof, and most of all with the stubborn belief that I didn't have to shout to be heard. I just had to keep building until the silence couldn't ignore me anymore. 2 months after the summit, something unexpected happened. One of the largest neighboring ranches, the Lockharts, who had built a reputation for scorning any kind of modern approach, reached out to request a full consultation from Solace Grid. When I got the intake form, I paused at the field labeled referred by. It simply said, Everett Lively. That name carried weight in this region. For years, my father's word had been law among landowners. Now the same man who once told me that real farms don't run on experiments was quietly recommending my name behind closed doors. Not because I asked, not because I begged for recognition, but because the work spoke louder than I ever could. When we arrived at the Lockhart Ranch, the foreman greeted us with hesitation. "So you're the lively girl." He said his voice wasn't unkind, but it wasn't welcoming either. "We heard good things." I smiled and shook his hand. "We'll let the data speak," I said, and it did. Within 3 weeks of testing, we identified outdated wiring, excess water loss, and soil degradation patterns that had gone unnoticed for years. Our solution cut their input costs by 17%. After that, they not only signed the deal, but featured us in their seasonal newsletter a year earlier. That idea would have seemed laughable, but something had shifted, not just in my family, but in the ecosystem that once ignored women like me entirely. Meanwhile, my relationship with Chase and Curtis continued to evolve. They didn't suddenly become best friends or model brothers, but they listened. They asked for input before decisions. Curtis even admitted during a call, "We should have talked to you sooner. I didn't rub it in. I just said, I'm here now. That I've come to learn is more powerful than any long speech." The biggest surprise, however, came in the form of a city permit. One Friday afternoon, my head of development walked into my office holding a letter. "Blake," she said slowly, "we just got a request from the county to fast-track installation of public solar stations at 4 locations along the rural commuter corridor. They want us to handle it directly." I nodded. "That's great." She hesitated. The request was signed by a new member of the Energy Planning Board, Everett Lively. I froze, not because I doubted it anymore, but because it meant he hadn't just changed privately. He was now publicly aligning his name with the thing he once dismissed. That weekend, I called him not to thank him, not to seek praise, but to understand. He picked up on the second ring. "You saw the permit," he said. I did. Silence. Then, "It's about time they started listening to someone who actually knows how this stuff works." I smiled. "You mean me?" He didn't answer that directly. They were going to put in those overpriced city panels. Looked like a mess waiting to happen. I told them SolisGrid had better numbers and better sense. I leaned back in my chair. "Thanks for trusting me. I trust results," he replied. "And yours keep showing up." That was his way of saying it. Not emotionally, not dramatically, but clearly. He had finally shifted from tolerating my success to standing behind it, quietly, but fully. We visited the 4 new sites together the following week. It was the first time I'd walked public land with my father as a collaborator, not as a daughter tagging along, not as the girl who didn't belong in the fields, but as someone whose work shaped how the land functioned. He didn't say much during those visits, but every time he stepped aside to let me lead a conversation, or pointed out something we could improve, I saw it for what it was, not concession, but respect. That evening, we returned to the ranch. He handed me an old photo as we sat at the kitchen table. It was faded,